Why does it still hurt, even when everything looks fine on the surface? Why do you wake up with a tight chest, a heaviness no one else can see, even though you've done everything right? Maybe you've tried it all. Meditation, therapy, pretending to be okay, telling yourself it'll pass. But the ache lingers, quiet, familiar, like an echo that follows you everywhere. Here's a truth most people won't say out loud. You're not suffering because of life. You're suffering because of what you've buried inside yourself. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That's not just a quote. That's your reality. This video isn't a motivational pep talk. It's a mirror. And if you have the courage to look into it, really look, you might begin to see why your pain exists and how it can finally end. On this channel, Psychology Insights, we don't sugarcoat the truth. We go deep, because healing doesn't start with comfort. It starts with clarity. So take a breath. Stay with me for the next 23 minutes. Because the moment you stop running from your suffering is the moment your transformation begins. If you're still here, it means you're not afraid to face the discomfort. And that already sets you apart from most. Because most people don't look inward. They look for someone to blame. The job, the partner, the economy, the pressure to succeed. And while all of those things can hurt, they're often just surface-level noise. The real storm? It's happening inside. Let's begin there. You think you're suffering because life is hard. Because of deadlines, failed relationships, bills piling up, the weight of expectations. And yes, those things are real. They press against your chest. They wake you up in the middle of the night. But they're not the root. They're symptoms. The real pain begins deeper, in the quiet war you're fighting with yourself. This is the war no one sees. It doesn't leave bruises, but it breaks you slowly. It happens every time you silence your truth just to be liked, every time you smile while your soul screams for air, every time you shrink yourself to avoid confrontation or say yes when your body wants to shout no. And it didn't start yesterday. Since you were a child, you've been trained to survive by becoming who others needed you to be. Be quiet, be polite, don't get angry, don't be too loud, don't ask for too much. Little by little, you buried the wild, honest parts of yourself under layers of compliance. You became a performer in someone else's script. You learned to wear masks so well, you forgot there was ever a face underneath. Now, you move through life like a ghost in your own story. You go to work, smile at friends, laugh at the right jokes, but something always feels off. Not dramatic, just hollow, like you're living in a beautifully decorated house with no furniture inside. That emptiness isn't weakness. It's not depression, laziness, or failure. It's your soul, grieving the life it never got to live. You're not broken. You're disconnected from your truth, from your voice, from the version of you that existed before the world taught you who you should be. And this disconnection has a cost. It seeps into everything. Your joy, your focus, your relationships. You can't quite explain it, but something is always missing, like a song playing just out of reach, a name on the tip of your tongue that you can't quite remember. Here's what no one tells you. The farther you run from who you are, the louder your suffering becomes. It won't yell. It whispers. In anxiety, in numbness, in overthinking, in a quiet sadness that lingers no matter how much you achieve. Your suffering is not your enemy. It's your soul knocking at the door asking, "Will you finally listen to me?" Because underneath all the roles you've played, there is someone real, someone raw, imperfect, beautiful, someone who never wanted perfection, just truth. And until you return to that self, the self before the world told you to hide, the pain won't leave, not because it's cruel, but because it's trying to guide you home. Once you realize that your suffering comes from disconnection, a new question emerges. What exactly have you disconnected from? The answer lies in what Jung called The shadow, the part of you you've denied, suppressed, or abandoned to survive. It's easy to think of the shadow as something dark or dangerous, but that's not the full picture. Your shadow isn't evil. It's exiled. It's made up of all the parts you were told not to be, the anger you weren't allowed to feel, the sadness you were shamed for showing, the ambition they called too much, the joy that felt too loud. Imagine a child who loved to dance until someone laughed at them, or a boy who cried when he was hurt and was told to man up, or a girl who spoke her mind and was called too emotional. Those moments don't just pass. They leave marks. They teach you what parts of yourself are acceptable and which ones must be hidden away. So you hide them. You lock them in the basement of your psyche. But here's the problem. What you repress doesn't disappear. It festers. It finds other ways to be seen. That unexplained irritation when someone gets too close, that sudden urge to sabotage a good thing in your life, that deep shame you can't quite name, that's not random. That's your shadow trying to speak. Take this example. You're in a healthy relationship for the first time. There's respect, honesty, no mind games. But instead of feeling safe, you feel uncomfortable, anxious, suspicious. You start picking fights or pulling away, and you don't know why. It's not because you're broken. It's because your shadow doesn't trust peace. Because for years, you were only familiar with chaos. Love was conditional. Affection came with punishment. So now, when something real shows up, it feels foreign, almost threatening. This is how the unconscious runs your life. You think you're making choices, but many of your decisions, who you date, how you react, what you tolerate, are influenced by parts of you you haven't even looked at. And until you do, you'll keep repeating the same cycles. So ask yourself, what part of me do I judge the most? What emotion do I constantly avoid feeling? When did I start pretending just to be accepted? These questions aren't easy, but they open the door to healing. Because the shadow doesn't want to control you. It wants to be acknowledged. Not fixed, not erased, just seen. You don't have to make peace with everything at once. Start small. When you feel triggered, pause. Instead of asking, what's wrong with me? Try asking, what part of me is trying to be heard? Keep a notebook. Write the things you're afraid to say out loud, the thoughts you usually push away, the feelings you were told you're not supposed to have. Let them exist, without shame. And don't do this alone. If you can, speak to someone trained, a therapist, a coach, or a mentor. Not because you're weak, but because this kind of journey is easier when someone holds the mirror with you. The shadow is not your enemy, it's your map. And the moment you stop fighting it, you begin to find your way home. So, let me ask you, what part of yourself have you been hiding the longest? And what would happen if, just for today, you let it speak? Now that you've seen your shadow, now that you've heard its voice, the real journey begins. What will you do with it? Awareness is powerful, but without action, it fades. It's like seeing the roots of a tree and choosing to pretend they aren't there. You can't change what you refuse to engage with. Carl Jung believed that true transformation doesn't come from insight alone. It comes from integration. And integration takes courage. Not dramatic courage, but daily courage. Quiet, consistent choices that realign you with your truth. Let me give you a real-life example. Imagine someone who always says yes to invitations, to work requests, to emotional labor. Even when they're exhausted, they wear the mask of being easygoing, kind, selfless. But underneath, there's resentment, burnout, a growing sense that their life isn't their own. Where does this pattern come from? Often, it's rooted in fear. Fear of being seen as difficult. Fear of rejection. Fear that if they ever said no, love would disappear. This is the shadow at work. A learned survival strategy. And the only way out is through. So how does healing begin? It starts small, subtle, intentional. The next time your body tightens when you're about to say yes, pause. Notice the discomfort. Don't override it. Ask yourself, am I agreeing out of love or out of fear? When you feel angry, Don't rush to silence it. Sit with it. Let it speak. Ask, what boundary was crossed that I ignored again? When sadness arises, don't numb it with distraction. Ask, what part of me is longing to be held, not fixed? These aren't just emotional exercises. They're acts of reclaiming. Every time you pause, instead of reacting automatically, you're reclaiming power from the unconscious. You're saying, I see you. I won't abandon you anymore. And that's the beginning of wholeness. But let's be honest. This work isn't glamorous. There are no instant results. Sometimes, it will feel like nothing is changing. Sometimes, facing yourself will be more uncomfortable than pretending everything is fine. But here's the truth. Healing doesn't always feel good. It often feels like doubt, like fatigue, like grieving the version of you that kept you safe, but also kept you small. Still, every moment of awareness is a seed. And with enough patience, those seeds become a new way of living. So I ask you, what's one situation in your life where your shadow still takes the lead? Where are you still saying yes when you mean no? Where are you still performing instead of being? You don't need to fix it all today. Just begin. Name it. Write it down. Say it out loud to someone you trust. Because once you bring the unconscious into the light, even for a second, it loses its power to control you in the dark. And that is how suffering begins to fade. Not by force, but by truth. By now, you've probably started to realize something important. Pain doesn't just visit you randomly. It has intention. It has language. And the more you try to silence it, the louder it becomes. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding pain. They fill their schedules, distract themselves with noise, chase success, or attach their worth to how together they appear on the outside. But inside, there's a pressure building, a quiet implosion that no one else sees. Why? Because pain ignored is not pain erased. It's pain postponed. And when it returns with interest. Think of a time you laughed in a room full of people but felt completely disconnected. Or when you achieved a goal you'd worked so hard for and still felt empty inside. That's not failure. That's feedback. A signal from within saying, this version of success doesn't nourish your soul. The truth is, suffering isn't the problem. Denial is. Pain is not the enemy. It's a messenger. It comes bearing information about what you've avoided, what you've betrayed in yourself, what needs to be faced. Let's take a real example. Someone grows up in a home where love was unpredictable. One day warm, the next day withdrawn. They learn to be hyper-alert, to earn love through perfection, through people-pleasing. Fast forward into adulthood, they become the strong one. Always reliable, always needed. But secretly, they're exhausted, emotionally starved, angry even, but they don't know why. It's not just stress. It's a deeper wound that's been waiting to speak. But here's the shift. The moment they stop seeing their burnout as weakness and start treating it as a clue, everything changes. They begin asking the right questions. Not, how do I get over this? But, what is this pain trying to teach me about the way I've been living? When you ask that question, sincerely, consistently, your suffering begins to change shape. It softens. It stops chasing you and starts guiding you. You begin to see the patterns. You notice how your body reacts in certain situations. You start connecting past wounds to present triggers, not to blame, but to understand. And through that understanding, you gain something precious: choice. You're no longer reacting blindly. You're responding with awareness. That's what real freedom feels like. Not the absence of pain, but the ability to meet pain without losing yourself. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the need to walk through the darkness, not bypass it. Pain, when truly honored, doesn't destroy. It refines. It strips away what isn't real. It burns through illusions. And what's left is clarity. So, ask yourself now, what part of your life feels heavy? Not because it's hard, but because it's false. What have you been pretending is fine, even though your body disagrees? What emotion keeps returning, no matter how much you try to bury it. Write it down. Name it. Not to control it, but to begin a new relationship with it. One built on curiosity instead of avoidance. Because once you do, pain becomes something else entirely. It becomes your compass, a sacred signal, pointing you back to what matters most, the truth of who you are. There comes a moment in this journey, not marked by fanfare or fireworks, when something inside you quietly shifts. It's subtle, almost invisible. You wake up, take a breath, and realize you're no longer fighting yourself. For the first time, maybe ever, you feel like you're actually living inside your own skin. This is what it means to begin feeling whole. But let's be clear, wholeness isn't perfection. It doesn't mean you're happy all the time. It doesn't mean your past disappears or that pain stops visiting. Wholeness means you're no longer at war with your own truth. You're no longer splitting yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. You've stopped trying to surgically remove what makes you uncomfortable, your anger, your grief, your fear, and started listening to them instead. Think of a person who's always been the peacemaker. They avoid conflict, suppress how they feel, smile through tension. Everyone praises them for being calm, stable, easygoing. But inside, they're tired. They feel invisible, because in trying to keep everything peaceful on the outside, they've created chaos within. Now, imagine that person finally saying, "Number." Not with cruelty, not with bitterness, but with clarity, with self-respect. That one small act, that one boundary, is the beginning of wholeness. Because at that point, they're not abandoning themselves to keep the peace. They're creating peace by being honest. That's the shift Jung pointed to when he spoke of individuation. Not becoming someone else, but becoming who you've always been, without apology or disguise. You stop editing yourself to fit in. You stop shrinking to make others comfortable. You begin living from your center, not from your wounds. And this doesn't make you superior or untouchable. It just makes you real. You'll still get triggered. You'll still feel fear. But now, instead of collapsing into those emotions or pushing them away, you'll meet them with compassion. You'll ask, what part of me still needs attention? What part of me hasn't felt safe enough to exist until now? This is how transformation becomes a lifestyle, not just a breakthrough moment. It's in the everyday choices. Saying no without guilt. Speaking the truth, even when your voice shakes. Letting joy in, even if it feels unfamiliar. Letting grief out, even if it makes others uncomfortable. Because once you stop betraying yourself, you stop depending on the world to validate you. You stop chasing approval like oxygen. You become rooted, not in who you should be, but in who you truly are. And from this place, everything changes. You start recognizing relationships that drain you, and you walk away without guilt. You stop negotiating your worth in spaces that demand you shrink. You stop striving for happiness and start creating meaning. So now I ask you, what would it feel like to stop performing and just exist? What would your life look like if you were no longer afraid to be fully, unapologetically you? The answer to that is the life that's been waiting for you all along. So now, you've walked the full circle, from confusion to clarity, from disconnection to inner truth, from suffering to self. You've seen how your pain was never a punishment, but a signal. You've begun to understand that your shadow was not your enemy, but a part of you waiting to be seen. You've learned that healing doesn't mean becoming perfect. It means becoming whole. Carl Jung didn't promise comfort. He pointed toward truth. And truth, as you've felt throughout this journey, demands presence. It asks you to stay, even when it hurts, to choose awareness over avoidance, to live with your eyes open, even when what you see unsettles you. But here's the beauty. Once you stop running, the pain stops chasing. It stands beside you. It becomes your teacher. And from that place, real transformation begins. You don't have to fix everything today. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to be willing to face what's real, willing to choose yourself again and again. Because the version of you that's fully alive, fully present, already exists. Not somewhere far off in the future, but here, now, beneath the noise, waiting for you to return. So, let me ask you, and really ask yourself, what part of this journey resonated with you the most? What truth did you hear that you can no longer ignore? And what will you do with it, starting today? Leave your reflections in the comments, not just for me, but for you. Write it as a promise to yourself, a beginning, a declaration. And if this message spoke to your soul, I invite you to subscribe to Channel Psychology Insights. This is not the end. This is just one step in a longer, deeper, more honest life. A life where suffering no longer controls you because you've chosen to understand it. You've chosen the path of self-awareness. You've chosen the courage to look within. And that choice, no matter how small it feels right now, changes everything. Thank you for staying. Thank you for facing yourself. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay honest, stay awake, and stay with yourself.